is amazing. Hi, everybody.
Nice.
How's it going? So I just wanted to, before I introduce the panelists today, who you probably know because their reputations precede them, but I will introduce them for you. I wanted you to introduce yourselves a little bit. I was really curious about what fields or practices or interests you're coming from. So could I ask for a show of hands for those who love to play games, or game players?
All right, very nice.
We're among our kin.
Our people.
Our people. Oh, am I not on? It says on. Yeah, look me up. But I can project. How many of you are educators in some form or another? You don't have to be teaching how to make games, but teaching anything. Okay, all right, we've got some educators in the house. And then finally, what was the third group?
Developers.
What's that?
Developers.
Oh, yeah. How many of you make games or will make games?
All right.
Okay.
That's a great
right
show.
on.
Awesome.
That's great. Wow, a lot of game makers or aspiring game makers. Well, we are too, all three. We have here up on stage Eric Zimmerman, Mary Flanagan, Richard Lemarchand,
Tracy Fullerton. They've designed everything from games that help you make games, Mary Flanagan's Grow a Game deck, to games that help you talk about games more deeply and critically. Eric Zimmerman in the metagame. I worked on that with Eric as well. Show the metagame deck, Eric.
Yes, Colleen.
Shameless self-promotion.
So now, how did your self-promotion get foisted onto me? That's right.
I just love doing that. You always do our self-promotion, Eric. Meditative and evocative games with artists like Bill Viola. With Night Journey, Tracy Fullerton's amazing foray into the world of art and surrealism in a lot of ways. And then finally, games that have you at the edge of your seat, wiping off the controller as it's slipping from your hands with sweat. Designer on the Uncharted series, Richard Lemarchand. So, yeah. Awesome. One more thing about introducing the panelists in my own way. Their bios are fully articulated in the program, so you can read them. Is that we're also all, now we're all just recently inducted. We have a new member, academics. Dun, dun, dun. This means that we're going to be talking for the next 5 hours. No, it's my job to keep everything on time. That's pretty much what I'm going to be doing, trying to keep the flow going. What's interesting is that we have the East Coast academics here, Eric representing NYU, Mary Dartmouth, and then over here we have 2 USC contingents. Yay. Richard just joining the ranks at USC, just announced a couple weeks ago. So we're going to do the East versus West.
Nice.
We didn't sit this way on purpose.
I think I don't know.
I think Colleen worked it out.
I know. I have my own ulterior motives for the panel. So as Laurel mentioned, the last panel was putting games to work. Now we're going to think about how games actually work in society and culture. Their broader meanings. We're going to be really referencing the exhibition itself as a representation, as sort of a core sample of how games have evolved, have grown, and also how they express so many different kinds of things over the last, actually 50 years. It's 50 years since the first video game, Space War. So that's exciting. And each panelist is going to take 5 to 10 minutes to tell an anecdote, tell a story about a gameplay experience or how games have connected to their work or lives. And in between that, I'm going to ask a question. We're going to kind of all talk about that, the person who just last spoke as well as the rest of the panel. And then at the end, we'll take questions from all of you. And I hope we'll have ample time for that. We'll really try to reserve that time. I think that's all I need to say. Did I get everything, you guys?
Sounded good.
They're also all my friends. I have to say, the game design community is a really supportive and wonderful community. So if you are new or want to get involved in this field, just be prepared to have lots of new friends. It's kind of great. OK, so Eric Zimmerman is going to go first. I've arranged these brief anecdotes in chronological order in terms of not how old each person is at the panel, but how old the game is that they're talking about. And so we'll go like this. We've got just one image to represent that. So could we get the slides up?
Do you need to
I can also
square
do
that?
that.
I'll just start talking, though.
I got
While
it.
they're going.
There it is.
Oh, good, right in my face. OK, so, well, Colleen asked us to talk a little bit about, start with something that's sort of personally meaningful for us. And part of what I want to do today is, although we're talking about an exhibition that covers the last 50 years of video games, I always think about games in taking the long view. I think about how computer and video games are connected to play and games on and off the computer. And that play is something that humans do, like making music or telling stories. That is part of what makes us human. And that as a game designer, I am inspired at least as much by sports and board games and card games, both ancient and contemporary, as well as computer and electronic games. One of the most meaningful experiences I had is that I feel that I was privileged to have a childhood of play. I grew up in the 70s in a small college town, and I really would play neighborhood games with my friends. And this had a huge impact on me as a game designer. We would play Cops and Robbers, Kick the Can, Ghost in the Graveyard. And what was amazing about games like that is that what was less important was the rules of the game, the sort of fixed structures of how you play and how you win. What was more important is what we did with those rules, what we did with those games. So while you can talk about why a game like Ghost in the Graveyard builds suspense, right? Because it starts off with one ghost in the graveyard, and then more people become a ghost. So you could say as a game designer, there's a positive feedback loop. The more people that get captured, then it's easier to catch other people, and the game has a natural kind of crescendo. But in addition to that kind of technical game designer speak, you can also talk about how it was a context for us to get to know each other, a context for us to really confront fears like dark spaces in people's backyards, a way to do role-playing and narrative and drama. And also a community where we played with those games. Right? We invented games. We curated our own kind of palette of games every night. And so that games are not just something that happens when game designers make them, but they're something that happens within a community of players. And I think what's interesting about, as we think about what's happening on the third floor, on the one hand, you could say that games come from a lineage of what I just talked about, really folk games. But something has happened with computer and video games, and also in paper games in the 20th century as well, that they become more authored. That games have kind of transitioned from being something which are designed by folk culture without a single author over time, over decades or centuries or even millennia, if you think about games like chess and Mancala and Go, to games that are technological. They're media, like mass media, like television or film. They're art. So there's interesting. For me, what's interesting about the show upstairs is not just the show itself, but the kind of conceptual transition and friction and similarities and differences when I walk across the hallway to the wonderful collection of contemporary art that's also on the third floor that I was just doing earlier today before the event started today. So that there's, as Constance said at the very beginning, introducing today's events, there's a relationship between games and learning and games and technology, but also games and beauty and games and art, right? So that's a kind of complicated mix. Now, I wanted to talk about combat in the context of all of this. This is a combat for the Atari 2600. And actually, I first played this game with someone who just happens to be in the audience today, Solon Simmons, my friend from 5th grade, who's a professor at George Mason University, who I stayed with last night, Solon. All right. So also a big part of my life as a gamer. Now, Jim G., who spoke on the earlier panel, has talked about the difference between a small G game, just looking at the individual game, and the big G game, thinking about games as the whole space in which the experience takes place. In between games, what you do with your friends, how you might research and find out about the game online and solve problems, beyond just the one-to-one experience of a person and a screen. And what I want to help convince you of is that usually when we look at computer games, even in exhibitions upstairs, there's a focus on the technology, on the visuals on the screen. But I think what we want to explore today in the panel is the big G game, right? Not just what happens between one person and a game. And that there actually are a lot of similarities between the way a game like Combat was designed and the games in my neighborhood. That Combat really happened. Combat was the first game released with the console, Atari 2600 console. There were earlier consoles, but the Atari 2600 was arguably the first really popular console, at least in the United States. And Combat shipped with as a two-player game. It's a game that you got when you bought the console. And I think that's kind of remarkable. Most of our earliest games, Pong and Space War and Combat, were for 2 players. So this idea of social play was something that kind of got lost a little bit in most of the history of computer games and is now coming back with a vengeance as we look at games for social networks and online games. Furthermore, Combat is a game that's not just one game. That if you look at those little switches on the Atari 2600, one of them is a game select. And one of the things that Atari did in an interesting way is that they always included many variations of games. So there was Tank Pong, Invisible Tanks, many variations of biplanes. Then they would mix and match. So there was Invisible Tank Pong, right, and things like that. And so there was,
favorite.
And so I think there were something like Solon. Do you remember 72 or 96 or 112? There were many, many different games that you could play. So even though today we think about customization, player customization, and creativity, and players making rules as something maybe which only happens in today's games or can't happen on the computer, there's a certain amount of that happening in these very early games. And the last thing I want to say about Combat is just that it's a beautiful game, right? I just want to echo again what Constance said, is that on the panel before we can also talk about the way games help us work and learn. But I also think it's important just to appreciate games as aesthetic objects that can be beautiful. And part of what's important is that I don't think we should have to justify games and be cheerleaders for games and say, oh, well, games are important because they teach you this thing, or they prepare you for future learning, or they can help society get better. I think that games, like telling stories, making images, playing or listening or making music, for example, is just part of what makes us human. And we should be able to look at a game like Combat, or rather play a game like Combat, and appreciate its elegant simplicity, the way that it really restricts you. You are a very slow-moving tank, but through that slowness and that difficulty, you kind of get a wonderful level of tactics and emergent play. It's not just a choose your own adventure where there's only a few things you can do. There's many ways for a single game to play out. Lastly, I just again want to connect a game like Combat to my neighborhood games. And for me, there's more similarities than differences when we think about a kind of very rich context of play. That game was not just about Solon and I playing Combat together, but it was also about having friends over to the house, exploring the whole kind of cultural context of a television, at what it meant to take a television image and make it interactive, rather than a sort of a passive thing. So there's kind of social and cultural big G games going on many levels with Combat. And to me, that, in addition to the design of the game itself, makes it beautiful and actually still really fun to play.
Yeah.
So that's my opening anecdote.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Nice, Eric. Thank you. Wow, that was beautifully put. That was great. I saw that the ESA might be here, and so
the Electronic Software Association.
Electronic Software Association. They do some of the best sort of data gathering around the industry, and so in that spirit, how many of you have played Combat? Let's gather some data. All right. Okay.
Maybe about half.
About half.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty
okay
good.
that have played.
Yeah, I should have raised my hand. Wow, that was great, Eric. I was hearing the game. The soundtrack to the game itself, I think, is really like, kind of minimal techno.
Yes. Yeah.
So I have a confession to make about all of us here. We're all about the same age. I think we're all about the same age.
Yes.
Eric and I are just a month apart. We've actually celebrated our birthdays together before, but. And so we're actually also the first generation to be raised on video games. You know, we all kind of encountered combat. We all encountered these games.
5th grade for me. I don't know about you guys, but.
Yeah, around that age. Right, so a very impressionable age, to say the least.
A little older.
Around then?
Yeah.
A little older.
Little older?
I'm not sure what 5th grade is in English, Manny, but I'm a couple of years older than you, Eric. So.
So presumably, at least some of us are a little bit more sophisticated than we were in 5th grade. I don't know about that all the time. But I think it's interesting to look at the games upstairs and ask that question of the games themselves. Are games more sophisticated than they were, you know, when we were playing them as kids?
The exhibition really proposes a kind of evolution, right? Yeah. Not through the whole exhibition, but a lot of it is structured like a timeline. There's the advances in mechanics section. So I think it is an important question. You can frame games as a technological advancement. And if you look at the graphics, for example, yes, resolution got higher. We moved from 2D to 3D. But when I think about neighborhood games versus combat versus the cultures around chess or competitive Scrabble or tennis.
I was thinking about Halo 2 the whole time you were talking. And because I had such a similar experience around that game. And everything you said could have been directly mapped to my experience in playing Halo 2. I mean, we even called Beaver Creek the backyard. So you get a text, meet me in the backyard, and everyone would come, and we would play like every night.
And you were playing online, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was really sort of the emergence of voice, and it was kind of this this moment when sort of like voice-based shooter games really worked. I mean, it really came together in a exciting.
And you were playing that when, like, early aughts, right? Wasn't that?
Yeah, when was that? Yeah, that was.
Would have been roundabout, early aughts.
Yeah.
But are you saying that you used the metaphors of kind of backyard play, of play
we
in
really thought of
neighborhood play?
In neighborhood play, I mean, you knew it so well. That was the thing. You knew the map so well. It became like your backyard, and you knew the people so well. And so it really did become like that extension of Eric's neighborhood that he's talking about, where everyone had the same kind of grasp and intimate knowledge of all the hiding spaces and fun possibilities that could be sort of eked out of a map and a combination of rules. So for example, for us, like rocket launchers on Foundation became this amazing game because of all the cement in this map, and you could just launch off of things and it would create complete mayhem by using rocket launchers in this limited cement bounded space.
Henry Jenkins, who's quoted in the exhibition above, talks about the transition from traditional 19th and early 20th century boys play, where boys went out into the world. And that was what my neighborhood game was. I did have a taste of that Americana, maybe the last gasp of it in the 70s, where we would walk on railroad tracks for miles and collect railroad spikes and come back and go out and play in the neighborhood, and our parents really didn't know where we were, but they knew we were coming back for dinner.
It's a different world.
Yeah, it's different now. And also, it was a small college town. But Henry Jenkins, a scholar who's now also at USC,
what is going on?
He writes about how that those physical play spaces are now replaced by virtual play spaces, and that part of the parental anxiety is that they're having a lot of those conflict-oriented games and fighting and tussling with each other. It wasn't always, young boys play is not always pretty, right? Nor young girls play, and nor should it be.
Right.
But it's happening literally under the roof or under the nose of parents, right? So that whole thing is shifting. So probably there are also young kids who had that same experience with Halo 2, rather than going out in their neighborhoods and playing.
Yeah. That whole idea of rules negotiation too is, I think, a big part of it that seems to be coming out of this.
One of the things I wanted to bring up in relationship to your question about this idea of evolution and Eric's kind of homage to this game Combat is not, it's not necessarily grounded only out of a nostalgia for a time and a place, but it actually is a kind of beautiful abstraction, and it has formal properties that are really, really in line with a lot of contemporary art and historic notions of art.
Right.
And so I want to kind of contextualize that, because a lot of times there's this notion of like, oh, that's so old school, it's primitive in a way. And
right. I think I may have used that word even.
Yeah, the sense of primitivism in applied to this perhaps could be misguided depending on the conversation.
Right.
I mean, one of the ways that we want to think about this lineage of play and of games is when you think of complexity. I guess my question back to you would be, well, what do you mean by complexity?
Right.
Because certainly abstraction takes a lot of complexity to actually get to the heart of something very simple. If anyone who's made games, you know that slimming down the play to an elegant system becomes a really interesting Zen moment of a reduction in complexity. So, there's a little bit of a fight about what really what you mean by complexity and how we can think about some earlier games and give them a little more due from an abstraction model.
Well, and clearly, Eric is referencing, Jim's comment around big G games, right? Which a lot of the complexity happening in combat is happening in the living room, right? It's happening between you and your friends, choosing which of the 112 options to play and what the house rules are. Yeah.
Well, and the fundamental aspects of the game itself. To come back to your question again, I mean, a modern video game is comprised of so many different systems which are complex in so many different ways, and yet there is a very complex system right in the heart of the game of combat. We were talking. I was telling Eric the other night that we spent the summer playing combat in the summer of 1990.
Oh, wow.
A full 8 years after this game was released.
I think it came out in the UK later.
We're a little behind the times, maybe, but not that badly. There were many more sophisticated game systems. We'd spent the previous summer playing on the Amiga, which was this mind-blowing new machine with 16-bit graphics. But for some reason, we found ourselves at our friend's house regularly the summer that we graduated with an Atari 2600 and the combat cartridge, and spent hours and hours and hours playing this game that by some people might have considered primitive, but of course that it certainly wasn't. It was complex and interesting and rewarding for us for hours on end.
That's excellent. Go back and play combat if you haven't. Let's hear from Mary. Let's hear your anecdote, and we'll keep returning to some of these questions and have ample time at the end. We hope to talk about them. Yeah,
sure.
Thanks.
So advance me. Yay. So we have an Atari theme going on, and this is part of our order. And I did also want to talk about combat. I had an Atari 2600 as my first computer, and it was my only computer until basically I graduated from graduate school. So I spent a long time with this machine, and I still have it after 30 years. I realized, wow, I still have all my cartridges in my same box. Anyway, you can come and play at my lab, although I'm very defensive about the cartridges with my students. I'm sorry to the students. So one of the things, well, I just want to give you a little bit of context because I studied film and then I went on to work in the software industry. And I'm really interested to think about the ways in which art relates to design and this border between thinking about art as art practice and thinking about design as game design for an audience in a particular time period with a particular user base. So that's something that I'm really interested in. And in my work, historically, I've done a lot of stuff with computer virus art and search engine art and computer programs that make artworks manifest. And I think it's interesting because a lot of it's taken a long time for net art and computer-based art in general, outside of video games, to actually be taken seriously by a lot of cultural institutions. And I think that's partly because, of course, new ideas are always challenging. You know, when Vincent van Gogh was alive, his work was considered really, really, I have the word that his peers used for him. It was something about the artists and the public were hostile to Van Gogh. I mean, he was literally kind of chased out of town in some ways because of the kind of work he made, and now we really respect that kind of work. And so that's a natural process. It's always going on when new ideas are introduced to art. And we try to work with that when we can. And I think this moment is significant for that reason, because we are actually going from a kind of hostile, you know, games aren't art, games are too pop culture, games too violent, games blah, 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 all the way into thinking, let's think about this stuff, let's really celebrate it, let's investigate it, let's move on with it. So for me, that's a really great moment. And there are some interesting stories about that. Like I had a show at the Guggenheim with a computer work, and I brought my mom to the Guggenheim to look at this computer work. And there's a painting of Picasso, and then there's a beige PC with a computer program running on it. And she was very confused by this, you know, and she couldn't. And so this work, which is called a Giant Joystick, which I made in 2006, was the first piece of artwork that my family understood. This was the first work out of years and years and years of doing all this technologically driven artwork that I could actually, that people would understand the idea and really say, wow, I know what to do here. I know what this is saying. I see what it's commenting on. I want to participate. And this was an interesting thing for me to engage with you know, creating a large-scale playable giant joystick as an artwork rather than as a design project. So for me, it had particular kinds of questions that wasn't about making a new product, but it was about kind of creating a different reflective experience about how we play and how we socialize. Now, contrary to some of the other folks in the panel, I actually had no close neighbors, and I actually played my Atari by myself. So for me, it's not bad. I loved it. I was like geeking out for hours, you know. But for me, play was not a social experience. It was kind of a mission and a quest, a kind of place for personal exploration in some way. So so it could be that as well. I think that that's the interesting thing about game systems, is that they're like a constantly moving, multifaceted thing. So for me, one of the things that I wanted to do with this project is to say, okay, how can I take a computational system, and I've been doing a lot of work in values in the game design process and values in design process, and I thought, well, what if I just take this object and I actually make something that's really familiar into a space for collaboration? I was actually motivated to think about ways in which people let their guard down when they're playing games, and they will play with people very different than themselves. But they will not do that necessarily to have a political discussion, for example. So how can we have people who are very different than each other? What if this joystick erupts on the sidewalk? So I started doing this set of, you know, what happens if this joystick, you know, shows up in these places? So I was doing these photoshops of like throwing joysticks into various kind of situations where people would have to encounter them. And what do you do with this thing? And of course, they're going to want to play it. So it was really important for me that the joystick could work. And I happened to, when I was photoshopping this idea around before I even built the thing, I put it in the Guggenheim. And I thought, oh, this is great. It goes all the way in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and it's like this massive tower to play. And I had imagined all of these things that this machine system artwork could do. My original idea was also to have it be 30 feet high. And you could play different kinds. You could play various cities, you know, so multiple people would get on one joystick, and multiple people could get another joystick, and you could have Paris play Berlin, and, you know, kind of have this like new sport evolve out of massive game equipment. So that was so one of the things of changing scale in this work was to create from something that was solitary to something that was collaborative. You can't really get on the joystick and play many of the games that are created from a classical Atari era, such as the ones in the show, like Pitfall and Combat. You can't really do that without engaging with other players, even if you're playing against the computer. So you have to station a person by the button, and several people move the stick around, and it becomes this interesting place where embodiment and people become aware of their bodies and their connection to each other, as well as the play space. So for me, when I think about this, and I think about the way in which designers are sometimes you know, designing for a particular audience and asking questions, I just want to bring up that artists have been working in games for a long time, basically through the 20th century. Various kinds of games, board games, card games, the Fluxus artists. There's a lot of engagement in the art community with games and play. And I think that this exhibition represents maybe the other story that hasn't really been explored, which is the commercial game community having a sense of artistic practice as well. So in that way, I think that I'm trying to get those worlds a little bit together, and this exhibition helps to have that conversation.
Yeah, excellent. Nice. Your example of the Picasso next to the you know, computer tower, I think, is a really interesting one. It struck me that when I was coming into the exhibition, the Namjoon Paik, like, I immediately saw it in a completely new context, seeing it next to a wall of video games, right adjacent. And so I guess my question for the group would be, So there's a lot of debate, actually, and thankfully Constance just settled it. So we're done about whether or not games are capital A art, right? And Constance said, yeah, they are, earlier today, which is fabulous. And of course, we have this exhibition alongside Nam June Paik. We have these games. And Mary, you did a great job of sort of talking about games within an art practice and then games from a more commercial design practice and finding their way into the museum. So have games made it as art? Are they actually, you think, sort of broader sort of culture, society thinking about games as art? And if so, what's the Van Gogh moment in games? Sort of what's that game that's having the villagers chase the game designer out of town?
Well, I feel no hesitation in saying clearly games can be art. I don't think that we would like to see every game as a piece of art. Sometimes a game is just a game. Also, you know, we have a little bit of confusion because in the modern era we'll often use the word game to refer to a video game or a digital game of some kind at least, and that can cause some confusion as well. But just as some movies are works of art and others are not, I think the same is true of games. Yeah. As far as Van Gogh moments go, I think we would probably each have our own favorite, wouldn't we? For me, as a professional game designer, a professional designer of video games for the last 20 years, I have a few personal favorites. Games like Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, because of the way that they, yes, thanks guys, yeah. Because of the way that they use the idiom of the contemporary character action video game, which is that's the field that I've worked in, and it's of particular interest to me, to convey a broader range of emotion than we have perhaps seen in the past with games. I don't know, what do you guys think? What are some of your favorites?
I would just question the whole question. I think that art is a very complicated and contested term. When I was an art student in the like turn of the 90s, there were still debates going on about should photography be considered art? Is folk art art? There are folk art museums. Does that mean that they are art or not art or something else? And the thing is, so the question is really, what is art? It can mean a lot of things. From a legal point of view, art in a lot of law means you know, a human-made, individual, protected speech that is afforded free speech rights. In that case, in that sense, yes, games are an art form and should be protected like other forms of expression. But that's not the way that most people mean it.
I was looking, I actually want to come out in support of Eric here. I was looking across the Supreme Court this morning. This is my very first visit to Washington, D.C.
Yay.
And thank you. It's particularly meaningful to me because I became a citizen a year and a half ago. And so looking across at
there you go.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I was going to offer my condolences.
Looking across at the Supreme Court, which declared video games to be speech, when was that? Within the last year?
Right, yeah. It was
recently,
just
right.
in the last year.
Critically important when we're considering games in this light.
But I think that's not the way that that's not what most people mean. So there's another way that, you know, I think that art, you can think of art as the art world, right? It's the institutions like the NEA or museums or people that sell work in galleries and call themselves art. It's like saying, is it a game? Well, is it sold in the game department of the department store? Then it's a game, because it's more about cultural consensus, institutional power, right? So that, but I also think that's usually not what people mean. Although the exhibition upstairs is an interesting case in point in terms of the mixing of, as Mary said, commercial game culture and art culture, right? A very prestigious art institution. I think usually what people mean is a couple things. One is, can people, is it afforded sort of respect within culture, right?
Yes.
Does it have cultural clout? Well, those things shift over time, right? So that graphic novels now are sort of considered alongside literature, but still not by many people. But it also depends on what country you're talking about and how they're respected. And games similarly are pop culture that's sort of transforming into being seen as more than mass culture and junk food and into something that might be considered aesthetically worthwhile. And lastly, I think a sense in which a lot of people mean it is just, can it be meaningful, right? Yes. Is it something that humans can get a meaningful kind of life-changing or personally meaningful experience out of? And that is yes. And that, I think, is actually a separate question from the institutional question about art. Because look at a game like poker, or chess. People devote their lives to it, sometimes in terms of scholarship, writing books about it, getting better, making their living at it. being addicted to it, but maybe getting lots of social relationships and having a whole professional identity through it, right? And so is it art or not? Well, that's a weird question. No, it is what it is. And in that sense, games might be bigger than art. Maybe games are actually a more important kind of master category, and art is something alongside, or something which you know, my feeling is that in today's society, art is no longer the quote-unquote art, or capital A art, as Colleen put it. That's not the thing that's causing people to go in the streets and riot. That design in our society and technology, these are other ways that culture manifests, or ways we talk about culture, that are equally as important to people. And games are very much intertwined with all of them. So all I'm saying is that we should stop having art envy. Art may be an interesting way to frame games. Like, hey, we could think about this game as a work of art. That's interesting in one of these ways. Just like we could think about your game Uncharted as storytelling. That's one way to look at it. That's not the only way. It may not be as useful for combat to think of it as a storytelling system.
Right.
So, but we should stop envying art. Like art is what we should all be aspiring to. And when we finally get there, won't it be great? And do we have it or not? We should feel guilty. It's just another cultural category.
But I think I heard you say earlier that games have won over art. So games versus art, games win.
All right.
But that's excellent. And I love the notion of questioning the question, which is part of what artists in art does. Fabulous.
So I have actually one other way of looking at it too, and that is it a form that artists can work in? So sort of focusing more back on the making, right, and the intent in the making, right? We have this sort of cult, you know, of the artist, right? The sort of lone artist working and with their angst and, you know, all this stuff by themselves, you know. And obviously games don't necessarily fit into that, although there are people who work alone and do sort of that kind of struggle. I mean, we saw that recent article on Jonathan Blow, for example. We know people, you know, Jason Rohr's a wonderful example. You know, people who work alone and who use the form in an expressive way.
Might be cause and effect with the article,
and they kind of fall into that. They fall into that mythology of the lone artist working alone. But I think we may be at a point where we can begin to expand our definition of art practice, right, in a collaborative way. So I had a personal experience working on the Night Journey project with Bill Viola, and Bill is a wonderful artist who was there at the moment when video was emerging. And when these same discussions were going on about whether video could be considered an art form. And so in a way, I felt like it was sort of this wonderful time for him to come and be engaged in this form when it was struggling in that same way to define itself. And the experience that I had was that he had a particular kind of practice. It's a very personal practice, and we had a kind of practice in my lab with my team, and we were a small team. We're not like the hundreds of people on commercial games, but we still had a sort of practice that revolved around design. And he had a very personal practice that was very clearly different. And I don't want to just point out saying that's an artist and we weren't artists, because I do believe that we had an artistic process, but there was a different quality to the types of discussions that that we were having. So, for example, when I would be trying to say, okay, well, let's think about what it is that we want to build, then he would always direct the conversation back to the experience, right? And then and it would be this sort of wonderful give and take until finally we wound up kind of going on this organic discovery process about each other's way of working. And I think that the game that we built comes out of both practices, and it's in some ways it's a hybrid form. You know, it's a hybrid understanding that we came to.
Excellent. Wow, great answers, you guys. Let's move on to Richard and hear your anecdote.
Well, thanks, Colleen. And actually, hopefully, I can segue quite smoothly from what you were just saying, Tracy, because I think that dynamic, the back and forth interplay between the large-scale collaborative effort that the creation of a modern video game like Uncharted 2 or Uncharted 3 takes. The interplay between that and then between the more unitary, almost more solitary creative process that our creative director, Amy Hennig, goes through when she's conceiving of the world, the story worlds of Uncharted, where she does, of course, she's in contact with the whole team all the time, but then she'll retreat and think about the story very intently for long periods of time. We see that same dynamic internally to our team. So that helps me segue into what I wanted to tell you guys about today, which is to do with the connection between this game, Uncharted II, which I worked on. I was the co-lead game designer on this game. I was the lead or the co-lead game designer on all 3 games in the Uncharted series, made by Naughty Dog, the terrific game developer in Southern California.
It's a game represented in the exhibition, too.
And it's in the exhibition, which is, forgive me, it's maybe a little egotistical of me to come along and talk to you guys about it today, but I'm so honored. The whole of the team at Naughty Dog is so honored that our game made it into this amazing exhibition at the Smithsonian. And I want to talk about the connection between our game and other games, many of the other games in the exhibition actually, but also to other forms of media. I've always thought that video games, in a way, are kind of like a sort of super form, an ultra form, because you could put almost anything from the entire history of human artistic endeavor into a video game. You could put a wonderful photograph in, you could put a piece of poetry in. Games often have games like ours often have the character of a movie. And that was really our design goal with Uncharted 2. Uncharted 2 follows the fortunes of Nathan Drake, who's kind of a contemporary fortune hunter. The game was our endeavor to recreate the kind of big blockbuster action-adventure experience that we all enjoyed in movie theaters in the 1980s, kind of in the heyday of the action-adventure film. Films, of course, like Indiana Jones, which was inspired by many of the... We were, of course, inspired by the great Indiana Jones films, but we were also inspired by some of the same sources that George Lucas and Steven Spielberg looked to, the great B-feature serials of the 1930s, and even older adventure stories than that, going all the way back to Robert Louis Stevenson and Treasure Island. But we wanted to do something that no one had quite managed to do to the degree that we wanted to do it before, which was to put you, the player, right in the middle of the action, and to keep you, as far as we possibly could, in moment-to-moment control of the hero Nathan Drake as he went on this amazing journey through the story world of the game. So there are many, many games upstairs that inspired us, and you can kind of trace an evolution through the art history of video games exhibit, leading up to Uncharted 2. And I pulled out just a couple of those games that, in my mind, are clearly our sort of historical ancestors. The one in the top right, of course, is Donkey Kong, originally designed by the person that many people consider to be one of the greatest game designers ever to have lived, Shigeru Miyamoto. This is actually Gary Kitchen's take on the game, his interpretation of the game for the ColecoVision system. And this was one of the first games to be a great example of what we call platform games. Games where the fundamental verbs of the games are kind of running and jumping, and then also some kind of conflict. In the case of in the case of Donkey Kong, it was Mario grabbing this big hammer to smash the barrels with. But what I also really like about Donkey Kong is that it didn't just take a major step forward in terms of implementing this new kind of play that wasn't really possible before the advent of this digital computer television system, but it's also how full of character this game is. Of course, there's a lot of drama and a story, albeit a very simple story, implicit in this simple screenshot. There's a gorilla at the top of a half-built building, a set of scaffolding, next to a woman that he's kidnapped, and then there's a guy down the bottom who clearly has to climb to the top to rescue his friend. And so it's that kind of marriage of story and moment-to-moment game action that we tried to be exemplars of in the Uncharted games. And we've now shifted from talking about platform games, we now talk about character action games. Some of the actions are the same. We have a lot of running and jumping in our games, but we also have more complex systems of combat in our game, shooting and lots of bare-knuckle brawling. And we also have more kind of problem-solving, puzzle-solving at the end of the day in our games. I also threw Super Mario 64 up there because talking about increasingly sophisticated game systems, Mario 64 was a very important game for moving the action from the plane of 2 dimensions to the 3-dimensional space, which brought all kinds of design challenges with it, not least to do with where the camera would be from moment to moment. And in fact, Mario 64 was a game that was nearly 10 years old by the time we began studying it for the Uncharted camera model. So there are many, many more games upstairs that I could have pointed to that we looked at, which led to the creation of the Uncharted games, whether it was Shenmue for the Dreamcast, which was kind of unusual as a video game. Fans of Shenmue will know that it was set in the real world. Most video games are set in fantastical worlds of science fiction or fantasy, but Shenmue, like our game, is set in the world of consensual reality, and you kind of have to work extra hard when a character can't just suddenly take off because of his jetpack or can't cast a magic spell to defeat a monster and innovate in some new ways. But as well as tracing this lineage, I wanted to tell you guys to connect Uncharted II into the world of culture and of lived human experience is to do with a story that we started hearing from players of our games soon after the release of Uncharted Drake's Fortune, which was the first game in the series. We started hearing this story that surprised us, but also really gratified us. We started hearing from folks that not only did they like our game for how playable it was? We'd got a lot of stuff right in terms of the mechanics, the sort of the on-the-button controls, so that the game felt very immediately responsive. But we also started hearing that people would find the game to be pleasing to them in kind of an unusual way, because they would tell us that not only were they enjoying the game, but that other people in the room who were sitting looking at the game with them were enjoying it as well, even though they weren't playing it. Whether it was their boyfriend or their wife or other family members. Our game is a storytelling game, so we kind of move between these phases of action and character-driven story. And we worked very hard under the direction of Amy Hennig, our creative director and lead writer, and our director of motion capture, Gordon Hunt, who is actually a director of television and theater with many decades of experience, who helped us craft, with the aid of our wonderful cast of actors, these nuanced performances, which we learned how very difficult they were to achieve. I mean, we say to each other all the time, it's so hard to make video games, but we also learned in the process of making these games how hard it is for a film director or a television director or a theater director to tell a good story with characters that really resonate, that are likable over time, that seem deep and nuanced. And this was something that we loved to hear from people, because it meant that we were really getting something right with our storytelling. And it made us think about our games in new ways. The first Uncharted game was only a single-player game, so we were expecting that kind of individuals would go into this world and hopefully have a great explorative experience full of wonder and excitement. But we realized that we were reproducing that blockbuster movie feeling right down to you and I sat in the movie theater next to each other with our bucket of popcorn and seeing something amazing and turning to each other and going, oh, wow, did you see what just happened? And that was something I think that is easy to overlook, you know, that single-player games aren't just about the game and an individual, they're about an extended community of people. And so that was something that we were very happy to hear.
Excellent. I'm hearing a theme from combat to Uncharted of what's going on in the room as much as in the game. So the question I have, and it relates somewhat to what you're talking about, Richard. I mean, you're showing several different kinds of games, different genres. You're really talking about actually mixing sort of filmic genres into the game itself. Mm-hmm. The show, curated by Chris Melisinos, I hope I'm saying? Melisinos, thank you. I also say Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. It's a really wonderfully curated show. I think it really kind of shows a broad span of time and lots of different platforms. It involved public voting. There was definitely the members of the public, game fans were able to actually, vote for the games that they thought should be included. And despite all of that, it's a very inclusive approach and broad-ranging approach. Do you guys think there's anything missing? Is there something, is there a genre, is there a particular kind of game, or a game itself, just an example of something that's missing in the show?
Would you have asked this question if Chris was in the room today?
No, never. He's probably watching as it's broadcast. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, you want to come out from backstage?
Did we not discover the missing Tetris?
Oh, yeah, I think, is Tetris in the show? I don't think it is.
I don't think it is. Yeah. I mean, it's a big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, how can you possibly,
it's
an impossible
50
question.
years of video
Yeah.
games.
Yeah, of course there are a lot of games missing from the show. I guess what I'm asking is something more along the lines of, all right, the show is framed as games as art, right? Yeah. Are there games that you think really should have been, how could you have
Well, one thing I think that's interesting about the question is that this is not a generic universal survey of games, because there is no such thing, right? There is no such generic universal survey of art. One person's canon of art would leave out a whole communities of other kinds of artists. And in a sense, you can think of an art show as an expression of the curator. And even though there was a public component, Chris comes from the console gaming world, the commercial console gaming world, and that is squarely where the show is planted. And that's okay, because that's a really important aspect of the history. So it really emphasizes console games you hook up to a television, not handheld games, and not that much computer games and for PC and Mac, et cetera. And it also doesn't, it does, like I said, show a kind of evolution, technological evolution. For example, in our present moment today, there's been this rise of so-called art games and indie games, which celebrate not high technology and cinematic visuals, but a lot of times the opposite of quote-unquote primitive-looking visuals, games that feel low-tech or lo-fi, big pixels, big chunky pixels, for example. So games that might explore personal expression in different ways. So there's a lot of these kind of smaller-scale games that didn't get into the exhibition. But I think the great thing is that there could be 1,000 exhibitions on games of this scale that all might have different selections from within the greater body of games.
So we'll see you next year at the next exhibition of games at the Smithsonian.
But you guys, maybe there's more specific ones.
Yeah.
Well, something that struck me when I was going through the exhibition was not necessarily so much what is missing in terms of an object, although Tetris is one of my faves. Yeah. But also the sense of some things were just differently interpreted. So for example, I went to go play Myst, and Myst is actually running on a much faster computer in the exhibition than it was released on at that time.
Oh, wow.
And so when you're playing Myst, you actually don't, so one, the transitions when you move are much faster. You're like, doo, 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 so it starts to be like a little bit of a first-person shooter kind of feeling. Like, right, come on, get out of here, go upstairs.
Wow.
And the only reason I noticed, so it's a different play setup to play it, but I did notice that I didn't really get it until I went into this elevator, right? The elevators, and then the video. No, his video. QuickTime Video takes over, and then it's like, I was like, oh my God, that's what the game was like. Oh yeah. So I had to recalibrate due to the technology, and this is something that's happened in my digital artwork too. And it's a big thing about software preservation. Do you record software in emulation? Do you rewrite all the code? Do you keep hardware? I mean, it's a huge thing about all of our technological artifacts and our basic cultural heritage from 1970 on.
And also in teaching these things, right?
Yeah.
So for example, I know you've been teaching, say for example, the text adventure. I think I saw a picture of your class looking at a text adventure. And I know that, for example, in my classes, when I ask my students to go and play some of the early text adventures, they come back and they're like, oh my God! How could you do that to me?
I had to read.
You know, exactly. It's
slow.
like assigning Moby Dick at this point, right? To say, I'm like, no, it's Zork. Come on, it's fun. They're like, no.
My students really like Zork.
Okay, you
Different.
send
I
them
know.
over. Send them over.
Yeah.
I think it's all, you know, it's context and it's you know, the pace of life, right?
It's different.
And the pace of technology is different, and what, you know, our sort of expectations about how quickly games go and is different. It's changed, you know, and we can never really go back. But as with all, you know, forms of art, when you come from another context and you're going and looking at something that was created in a different context, you have to, I think, to some extent, try and understand its original context as well as you might.
Right. Yeah, I know Ian Bogost recommends playing Atari games not through an emulator, but actually through the old school scan, you know.
Okay, so one of my favorite
sets.
games, Pool of Radiance. My friend Sam Roberts has played an emulator, and he's telling me, oh, it's so wonderful, it's so wonderful, we should play again. I said, oh yeah, let's play again. So I dug out my old Macintosh with my old setup, and we had the disc and the little, you know, code wheel, so you couldn't, you know, just copy the disc and give it to your friends. And I dug it out, and we got some pizza, and we started playing, and it took us, you know, an hour and a half to set up a party, and then it took another like hour to just go through the first part of the dungeon, and we were like, okay, we're done. Because it was interminable. It was interminable. We're like, let's crack out the emulator. Let's
But the interesting thing is Myst. I mean, there's a time limit on the play here, right? So you also can't.
Time is a funny thing.
Time is a really interesting aspect of the show. I think that people should investigate. It's really interesting.
And speaking of time, let's go to Tracy.
Is it time?
It's really excellent.
Let's, can we forward? So actually, this is a very good segue into what I wanted to talk about, which is I wanted to talk about sort of a certain kind of games that I'm particularly interested in, which is games that have a space and a time for reflection, or perhaps not entirely, but in their pacing have this invitation for players to engage in a kind of internal dialogue with themselves, so to speak. And it's connected to the more simplistic argument that often gets made about emotion in games, right? So there's this argument goes that if games can make you cry, then somehow we've made it, right? And I think that's a really simplistic measurement. I think it's not an interesting ruler to lay games against, right? Because when I think of the meaningful pieces, whether they be interactive games or whether they be sort of more, say, for example, traditional media like animations or films, things like this, that give me that same kind of reflective space, it's not about crying, right? It's about going on this arc of a journey where you connect and attach to whatever the elements are, whether they're characters or terrain or story, whatever it is, you connect and attach, and then your relationship changes and shifts, right? And it might deepen, and it might get dark, and then it might grow high again. And these are things that interest me because this is a palette, not just of emotion, but of a kind of growth and attachment and shifting and changing intellectually as well as emotionally. So I think it's a much more interesting idea. And I pull out Flower as a particular example because, well, first I have a story about it, but also because I think it is one of those games that does have that. But there are other really wonderful games in the exhibit that do this as well. So Shadow of the Colossus has already come up, and I think this is a game that plays with sort of alternating high intense action with these long meditative times where you are just allowed to reflect on what has happened and what's coming, and that's important, right? I mean, in a novel, we often have long passage like that, and we think nothing of it. But I think in a video game, it's striking and really quite wonderful. So I wanted to sort of tell this story because because I had one of those media moments. In our family, we play together all the time, actually, just to build on Rich's story. I've played with my niece and nephews as they were growing up. And they were leaving me behind. They don't want to play anymore. But no, I'm kidding.
Because you beat them.
But I played with them when they were growing up quite a bit. In fact, we played, for example, all of Zelda Wind Waker, just sitting in front and trading the controller back and forth. And I would have to take it when the scary monsters came, you know. But we would all play together, and it was like a sort of, in a weird way, an interactive cartoon, you know, that we were all attached to. And I played Flower with my nephew. He was going through a particularly hard time at home, and he hadn't talked about it at all. And the way the game is structured, you spend the first 3 levels really building this really positive relationship to the environment. It's, you know, it's sort of there's the training sort of birth level, and then there's the color level, where it's all about this sort of gray or brownish landscape and bringing color to it, and then the wind level. And just about the end of the wind level, it starts getting, there's these inklings that things might not be, you know, all wonderful. And I thought, oh, I've made that classic sort of parenting mistake where you forget that, you forget that in Fantasia, it's not all about happy buckets, that things get bad and dark, right? And you forget that Bambi's mother dies, and you're like, oh, crap, what have I done? I've put him in front of a piece of media that's about to get dark, you know? And what's interesting I noticed about it was that when we got to the sort of the night levels and then the sort of wasteland level, where that I realized that they'd done a wonderful thing. They changed the pacing. So while in the wind level and the color level, you're moving really quickly, and it's all sort of exhilarating and wonderful. And then when you get to the dark level, things slow down. And there's this sense that you have to be careful, and you have to move slowly. And my nephew was playing, and he got very serious and very quiet. And I said, "Do you want to stop?" And he said, "No." He's like, sometimes things get bad. And it was the most he'd ever said about the things that were happening in his life. And so it was really meaningful to me, because I realized that the game had elicited this permission for him to have some feelings about something that was going on in his real experience that he hadn't given himself permission to have before. So that was my story. And those are the kinds of games that I'm really interested in seeing more of.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you.
We all talked about our families.
Yeah. Great. Well, we have ample time now for questions from all of you, so please line up. There's microphones along either side, and we'd love to hear your questions. That would be great. I see some folks
leaving. I think people are leaving.
No, they have notebooks, and they're preparing.
They're prepared. They're prepared. Okay, over here.
Hello. As I'm sure you've just discussed, games can have a very emotional impact. And as I know that there are some humor in games, like Earthworm Jim, where you launch a cow into the air from a scrapyard, or like Portal with all of GLaDOS's lines. And there's Monkey Island. Everyone knows that. But my question is, why don't more of these games exist? I mean, for all the Earthworm Jims, there's not a whole lot of these kinds of humorous games. So why don't we see more games that try to deliberately try to be funny, as opposed to just throwing in bits of humor?
Well, I would love to answer that question if I can, and I think it's an absolutely great question. It gives me a chance to blow the Naughty Dog team's trumpet a little bit more, because one of the things that they wanted to achieve with the Uncharted games was to get more comedy and more romance back into video games. Because these two things are fundamental for all of us. They're part of the basic stuff of being human. And yet we don't see them. You're quite right. We don't see them as much as we might expect to in video games. I think part of the answer to your question is to do with timing. of course, you know, we talk a lot about the struggle for video games as a storytelling medium, and is it possible to have an interactive story or not? You know, we on the Uncharted games chose to tell a very linear story, which meant that we could focus on solving the kinds of problems to do with moment-to-moment gameplay that we wanted to, leaving us free to tell a story in a you know, rather conventional way, even though the story had to be constructed to tie into the goals of the gameplay. But in doing so, we gave ourselves the opportunity to inject humor into the game at a time when it would work. If in a more open gameplay experience, perhaps like one of the wonderful Rockstar games like a Red Dead Redemption or a Skyrim, where the player is really the author of their experience at a more macroscopic level, if the system tried to inject humor in, it might be at just the wrong time for the player, and then it wouldn't work. It would come off as too dark. So I think that's one challenge, is to do with timing. I think there's ways around it, and I think we're starting to see a lot more. I'm very excited for the adventure game that Double Fine are going to make with their Kickstarter fund, because I'm sure we're going to have a lot of belly laughs with that.
I have a very different approach to that answer. I think it reminds me a little bit of what Jim said about violence today, or racism in relation to Grand Theft Auto. That's calling that game racist a little bit is kind of judging it by the criteria of a book or a film or other content-based media. So if we think about really when games are funny, it's to me, even romance, what if we talk about it less about characters saying funny things in a game or funny writing in a game, and more about the humor that emerges from a game. I think of games like Twister or charades that are or what?
Joust.
that are hilarious. Now, they're not
versus
hilarious
Zombies is
because
funny.
there are characters that are saying funny things in the game. They're hilarious because by playing the game, you end up doing funny things
Angry
and
Birds is funny.
performing in a funny way. So that's another approach that's less of the simulating the emotion that you want between characters on a screen, and more about thinking about this idea of what is the player doing, and can it be funny among them, and can the game just be part of that social system that ends up making a funny thing happen?
Yeah,
That's
another
a very
approach.
good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Awesome. Let's go to the other side.
Hi, I feel like I'm watching this special coven of Dr. Gamers, which is, so with that in mind, I'd like to talk a bit about the R-word research. I'm wondering if any of you would be willing to share some things that particularly excite you in terms of games, learning, and research that you are either working on or you would like to see explored more or have more support for.
Yeah.
You said games, learning, and research, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I got one.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I'm working on a National Science Foundation project to develop a suite of games to combat stereotypes and biases for women entering science, math, technology, and engineering fields. So that's an area. I have 4 studies going right now and have like 20 prototypes, and we're doing some massive digital and analog versions of different kinds of games that can kind of rewrite stereotypes and biases as you play them or bring them up or kind of engage with a lot of issues. And I have to say that I kind of take issue with the racist comment in Grand Theft Auto. I mean, not that I'm saying that Grand Theft Auto wouldn't be a racist game, and this is really to my research, so that's why I'm kind of getting away with this. Hopefully, is that I think that we can't just always then say, well, there's a little bit of a tone that says that games are then excused because they're so different than they're different. We don't have our critical tools to assess this, so therefore we can't address some of the issues of race and gender and stereotypes and violence. Like that can't happen either. So I think we just need a common area where yes, definitely playing the game actually is a different kind of experience, but we still have our critical faculties to be able to say this isn't right and this is right. And I just wanted to point that out because I sometimes felt like there's a way in which we can say, oh, games are a different animal, therefore we don't judge them.
I think that's a great point. And I mean, I'll go on record and saying the cultural politics of mainstream games are totally fucked up and generally reprehensible, right? Like most of mainstream culture.
That's right.
Walk up to a magazine rack and look at the way that gender is portrayed on the covers of magazines, and it's mind-blowingly stereotypical. And
Yeah.
the same thing is happening in games, and I totally agree that it shouldn't be happening, and we do need to be culturally very critical of games. You know, I also think from a designer's point of view, I was trying to specifically reframe a question about humor in games, right? And I think that we have to be able to look at games from multiple points of view. But one of those is really looking carefully at politics of representation in game cultural politics. So I totally agree with you there.
Yeah. I have another answer to the original question.
Yeah, the research. And,
Research.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hey, did I just say a bad word in the Smithsonian? I'm not.
You're out of here.
I actually have two very different examples. One is the suite of games that Jim actually already referred to, the collegeology games that we're doing in my lab, which is a sort of a really large-scale suite of projects. It's multi-year endeavor where we're making interventions to help kids who may not have access to college counseling or maybe first generation college going or potentially college going, understand their path and their potential to higher education. And so these range from card games to a Facebook game that launched just recently, a iPad and an iPhone game that's coming out for middle school kids, and this will have, like, you know, there's a whole other half of the team that I'm not on, which is doing research about the effects of those games. But so that's sort of one really large project, and then I have on the other side a really small project, which until last week was self-producing, self-funded. And this is a personal investigation of making a game about Thoreau's stay and his experiment in living at Walden. And last week was announced that it was got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, so we'll be able to pursue this. And so we're really happy about this kind of, you know, validation, I guess, of more experimental path for game research.
That's great.
You know, we haven't had till now, so it's
A
great.
couple of great conferences
Exciting.
coming up: Games, Learning, and Society, Games for Change,
Yeah.
full of great presentations on games, learning, and research.
Definitely Games for Health. Okay, so we're going to go into the lightning round, and everyone's going to answer very quickly, and we're going to try to get to as many new questioners as we can. Let's go over to this side here.
Okay, I'm hoping to go into video game studies, and I find myself in a weird place because I very much consider myself a gamer. When I was a kid, my childhood game was playing Snake and Raiden, actually. So, thank you. But I'm also training in visual cultures and art history and religious studies.
Wow.
Nice.
So where I'm at right now is I'm wondering how we as scholars should be reading games for people who are not as exposed or haven't been as exposed to them as we have been growing up.
Okay, all right.
What do you think?
Well, me, I guess I'm the, yeah.
The number of people who are not exposed to games is dwindling. So 97% of American teenagers play games. So you just have to decide who you're writing for. I don't think that we necessarily, like I said, we don't need to be cheerleaders. We don't need to explain to people. Let's be snobs. I want, the number of people that are playing games video games probably outnumber those that don't.
Unless they're your PhD committee.
So
And
scholarship on games. Scholarship on games no longer has to mean explaining games to people that don't know what they are. I would love to see people like film scholars who don't have to explain, here's what a film is, here's what editing is, right? So I would follow your passion and forget the people that can't see it. Let them catch up with you. Don't slow down for them. That would be my advice.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Nice.
Good advice.
Let's go over here. I have a question.
So you guys were talking about earlier how you're the first generation that's grown up with games, but we still haven't seen a generation that's gone into their golden years with games yet. And how do you think that games will evolve to serve the growing generations that are growing older, and how it'll serve multi-generation gamers, really young gamers to really old gamers, and how that'll change the industry?
Oh, nice.
It's a really good question.
As we head into our golden years.
I want to just point out the work of Celia Pierce, because she does a lot of baby boomer gamers. And so she's got a lot of research on that area.
Oh, wow.
So there are some scholars working on that, and I don't know if we're in our practices working
Tracy's
on.
done research on intergenerational gaming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, but really not about the kind of older gamers so much as parents and children playing together, which is a particular thing I think is critical. I mean, if you're going to read with your kids, then why not play with your kids, right?
Yeah.
And I think that getting into that habit of playing together means that as people grow older, then they'll begin to play with their grandkids and so forth. And I think it's extremely healthy, way to engage with any media is to do it together, right?
We're working on some games between the elderly LGBT community and high school students.
Nice.
So there's a bunch of stuff
Nice.
going on in that realm.
And something that I'm very
We meaning Parsons and Pet Lab, the lab that I run there.
Of course, yeah. And something that I'm very excited about in this area is the way that we sometimes, as game developers, we wonder why aren't there more games like Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, these games which are maybe perhaps a little slower and more meditative in their pace. And I am very optimistic that as we as a gaming audience age, we'll be voting with our dollars, and more games like that will get made.
Yeah, that's
Right.
that's right.
Yeah, games are exploding as pop culture, and I think they're going to seep into every corner of every audience. And so if we're now seeing, like the kung fu and boxing of games, we're going to also get the tai chi and qigong of games, right? So this
And we're never going to stop gaming, right?
Right, never.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's hear over here.
All right, something Eric said caused me to recombinate my original question a little bit. So I sort of see this duality in terms of stories and games largely. We sort of have this RPG type story, or Uncharted type story, I suppose, where we have defined characters and actions. It almost seems like they're cinematics with gameplay interspersed in between them. And then you might see sort of like, these games where the avatar is meant to be representation of the player. And they're sort of be able to inject themselves into it. The problem sometimes is that sometimes it's harder for the latter with this character injection to create the kind of the levels of stories, the complexities of stories that are capable with defined existing characters. How could you sort of reconcile those?
Go, that's for you.
I'm looking at Richard.
15 seconds or less.
Yeah.
I guess my
fire round.
short answer to this question is that because games are this kind of super form, there are a million and one ways to do it. There are, as many different approaches to this form as there are stars in the sky, as there are electrons in the universe. So there's no one right answer.
All right, great.
In considering the vast amount of /gaming fan fiction there is out there on the internet, I was wondering if you guys have any opinion on if, as women who are usually the authors of this fiction, if there become more women game designers, if games in general become less heteronormative, or if you think how you think gaming will change as the gaming designer community becomes more diverse.
Nice question. I would just pipe in. Eric was talking about playing in his neighborhood. My neighborhood was all boys, so it was a great preparation for being in the game industry.
Yeah.
And Anna Anthropy has written a wonderful book called "Rise of the Video Game Zinesters." Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wholly recommend it.
You really should check it out. She's addressing this topic head on and really encouraging people to make games about their own experiences and really trying to, she's sort of leading the charge for more diversity in games.
It's really a critical mass question, and it's possibly changing.
I think it.
Right, and I think diversity of developers is part of the equation, but I also think a lot of it is also, for example, getting game education programs to emphasize the cultural aspect of games so that they're not just focusing on technology and craft, but also on what are the cultural implications of what you're doing, how is what you're doing fit into other forms of art, entertainment, and media over the decades or centuries. So I think that it's, I think our programs maybe are more exemplary, but for every one of our programs, there's 100 where it's really just come in and learn the software and churn them out without getting the critical thinking component that Mary mentioned earlier. So I think that diversity of developers is important, but it's just part of the equation.
Yeah, more game making in schools, more game making in art classes.
Informed.
But the good news is that there was a period several years ago when it looked like games were going to be all Hollywood and no independent cinema, and digital distribution has completely changed that and made smaller scale games available to the masses in a way they weren't 10 years ago.
It's an exciting time. Wow, we have 8 more minutes. I think we can do this, you guys.
We can do it.
We can do it. Come on,
If I keep my mouth shut, we can do it.
I feel like my question has already been answered, but I'll ask it anyway, since it's 60% women on this panel, which is such an exciting number. Hooray for us. And one named Tracy, which is my name. Yay! So I was wondering if you had any advice for women who might be interested in going into the game industry in the future?
Do it.
Do it.
Yeah, just dive in. Yeah, I think you'll find that as I mentioned before, all of these guys are my friends, at least as far as I know.
Not anymore.
But it really is an inclusive community and a really supporting one too.
I mean, let's not paint a rosy.
Okay.
I mean, it's supportive, but it also, there are challenges too. But I think that the issue is you have to follow what you love, and I do agree there are more spaces opening up.
Yeah.
And more diverse, smaller developers. I think
and we're
that
a
really
funny little pocket within the game industry. We're not the.
We are not the whole game.
We are not the whole game industry. And if I could just say that, one of the things I think it's wonderful to see all these programs in game design, development, and game studies emerging. And I think one of their values, one of the things that they can bring is that they can be a place where it's a pathway for people who might not otherwise, yes, young women, but other types of individuals as well who have different backgrounds and different ways of thinking about games and play. It could be a pathway for them into the industry, where in the past, it was more of an apprenticeship sort of model, right? Where you came in and maybe you were a tester, or maybe you had a degree in computer science, or maybe you had no degree at all. You were just a hacker, right? But whatever it was is like more of a sort of you paid your dues kind of scenario, and you conformed and you made your way up, And I think that what universities offer are space for individuals to develop their own practice in a culture that supports that practice, and to experiment with these new kinds of ideas that we want to see, coming into the industry, and to make demonstrable versions of them, which you can then go out and show. And then the industry itself, of course, is going to absorb all that, but that's a good thing, right? And then it becomes more and more multifaceted.
And in my experience, the mainstream of the game industry is broadly meritocratic, even though it has a whole bunch of issues to deal with around this subject matter. And so, it's a question of making
Make
cool
something
stuff.
cool. Awesome. And find a mentor.
Yeah.
Cool. Connect you.
I work at a large public high school in the college advising capacity, and I often get asked by kids who are interested in this field, which is a preferred path to take. Some kids are very creative, so they want to do the storyboard part. Other kids are very good in traditional art, the art of drawing, and others are very gifted in computer science. Do you see a preferred path for a young person today?
Should I jump in, or do you guys want to?
I'll just quickly say that I think people have to follow what they love. So if they're really interested in computer science, they should really follow that thing and not try to pick up art. I mean, the pay grade is very different for those areas. I mean, it's just a practicality, especially if it's a working class neighborhood or something. I mean, like that, the skill levels and things may come into play as far as your possible career trajectories. But you guys,
there's so many ways in.
Right, just like film, entering the film industry, you can be an actor, a writer, a cinematographer, a carpenter, a set dresser, a makeup artist. Similarly, in games, you can do music and sound, you can do animation and visuals, you can do programming, you can do project management, game design. You could do writing also.
Marketing.
There's a whole whole range of disciplines. So there's not one career path. It's a very large industry. But you can even become a curator, a historian, scholar, critic.
If I could, though, and I think this is another thing, another value that is being brought by these programs that that we all are part of. And that is, yes, you can specialize, right? But part of contributing to a field like this, an artistic, creative field like this, is being a whole individual, right? Yes. And so not specializing too early, and going and studying other things as well, right? So you don't want to be a butt in a seat that is just churning out the storyboards, right? You need to be a whole individual who's studied art history, or who's looked at sort of cultural modes of play, or who's tried programming, even if you're an artist, right? Who understands the procedural language that the games are made of. So this is important, and so I would say that counseling them to explore around various areas, even if they want to specialize, is critical.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, we have 2 minutes left, and we can get you guys.
We're gonna get to them.
Yes.
Okay.
So as educators who are training the next generation of game developers, what sort of skills or knowledge are you trying to impart in them that are going to help drive the industry forward, to help it to evolve and move to the next level instead of just churning things out that are already in existence?
Well, I guess this will be, in a way, a coda to the answer to the last question that the guys gave. And so my 2 cents would be that when asked about this, my mind often immediately goes to sort of computers, because for working in digital games, at least, because the language of computers, programming, and the other tools that we use are sort of the lingua franca. They're what make it all possible. And no matter what role you have on a project, you have to interface with that world in some way. However, as Anna Anthropy points out in her book, Rise of the Video Game Zinesters, the tools that we have for making games are getting easier and easier to use with every passing year. Yeah. And so that level of technical expertise becomes less relevant. And so what your comment made me think of was what my friend Robin Hunneke always says whenever she's asked about what should you use, what skills should you learn, what should you do to become a great game designer. Robin, until recently, was a producer at that game company who made Flower and Journey. And her answer to the question always flummoxes her audience, because she says you should travel and you should read books. Nice. And I think it's that kind of broad perspective that really underlines what everyone else said in answer to this subject.
Good answer.
Well, with that in mind, I think that should be our charge. And I want to thank everyone. Great questions from the audience, and thank our panelists here today.
All right.
And Colleen, great job.
And Colleen.
That was really hard.
Thank you all so much for coming. I know I got a lot out of today, and I hope you did too. I just have one quick announcement. While I'm very sad, particularly after that last panel, that Chris Melasinos couldn't be here today, he is gonna be here up in the exhibition at 5 o'clock for around an hour, and he loves talking to people a lot. So please come up and say hi to him and ask him why Tetris isn't in the show. Thanks.